Welcome to another edition of the Insight Show with myself, Jaswant Bora, here on the Sky Akaal Channel. On today's show, we have very two distinguished guests speaking on the subject of racism in sport. The guests are with me today, Professor Ellis Cashmore and Lincoln Moses, MBE. Welcome to the show, both of you. Just to introduce yourselves very briefly. Professor Cashmore, you're a professor of sociology and you studied quite a lot about racism and written articles and collaborate a lot with universities, and you've been in Toronto, Hong Kong and various different places all over the world, and you know you've worked quite extensively with the people from young people from the black community and etc. etc. And obviously first I'd just like to start with yourself on this particular issue of racism in sport, which seems now to be continuing to repeat itself. We've seen over the history, over the years, of cases and disturbing things that have taken place. From we talk about with Suarez and Patrick Evra, who received an 8-match ban for being racially abusive to Patrice Evra, which allegations that he denied. There are cases also with Raheem Sterling last year and the chanting of other particular players who are experiencing abuse, in that even far as like the NBA in America, where people like one of the greatest players who played the game, Patrick Ewing, was experiencing abuse as he was coming up. So it's a widespread phenomenon. In your view, Professor Cashmore, how serious is this problem as we are seeing it constantly over the local, national and international media?
Obviously it's a problem in any form that it expresses itself. I mean, racism is just an undesirable phenomenon, and we should make every effort to rid our society of it wherever it appears. Football, of course, has been the only sport really historically where it's manifested itself. But as you say, in recent years we've seen examples of types of racism in basketball, in the NBA, as you said earlier. Also in hockey in Canada, which previously hasn't experienced racism. But my own interest really came out of football. I mean, way back when I'd just finished my PhD, and in the late 1970s, early 1980s, football was very different from how it is today, and there weren't that many black players. There were some, and they were appearing, they were subject to the most vile abuse. I mean, we look back now, and people who can't remember, I'm old enough to remember, but those who say, well, we used to get chanting and bananas being thrown and monkey noises. These weren't occasional things. These happened every single game in the early 1980s. And that's really what got me into my research, because I thought, how are players themselves reacting? And so I interviewed not just footballers, black footballers, but black track and field athletes and black boxers, to try to compare the experiences in each. Now, there's very little racism in boxing or athletics, but in football it seems to have been a problem that we just assumed that it had gone when Sky came along and transformed the game. We thought, oh, you know, everything in the garden is wonderful now, racism has gone away. But of course, I think we went to sleep on the job and just ignored it. And when it appeared, as you said earlier, with the Patrice Evra Suarez incident, I think that was really the wake-up call. And that incident made people sit up and take notice of the fact that this isn't a problem that disappeared. This has probably been there all along. It's just that either we've been ignoring it, the players have been ignoring it, or probably more important, the media has ignored it.
Something on a global scale that people are seeing happening. I mean, Lincoln, you've done extensive work over the years, for the past 25 years, working at grassroots levels. You've work with young people, even other aspects are related to people at risk of crime, antisocial behaviour. You work in organisations and collaborate with organisations such as Kick It Out and others, and sit on an advisory board. You've even been privileged to play under lawn of Buckingham Palace. So I was reading and seeing with Prince Harry. So I hope you, sorry William, I hope you managed to score there. In your work and what you've been seeing over the years and the roles that you have, and even with Sport for England, are there concerns at grassroots levels? Are there fears or apprehensions of young players, particularly BMA and other players coming thinking, look, what we are seeing is something that they're fighting against, and we're supposed to have. But we're talking about sport. We're talking about laws that exist to promote people coming through the system. To what extent are there some of the challenges at grassroots levels and with the great work that you've been doing?
I think some of the issues in terms of racism has been increased, especially quite recently. There's a surge in a lot of racial activities at grassroots level. At one time there was a little lull, and the FA and the Institute link to football used to fight the racism situation, but what has happened now with the change in social issues, you usually find that at grassroots level now, a lot of the problems is swept under the table. You'll find that communities now are against each other depending on your political background, in terms of not only your political background, your ethnicity, and everything combined together. There's consistent problems occurring, but there's nobody to go to. And I says nobody to go to because 4 years ago I was the chairman of the County FA Race Equality, and the FA decided we don't need a race equality because there's a decline in racial claims. Within 6 weeks of that going, they was bombarded with racial issues, but they had no one to take it to. Again, we have to look at the institutional problems as well, which are set in. No one seems to take racial issues as serious as they did 5, 6, 7 years ago. Kick It Out seems to be the only organisation which is fighting against any racial accusations. The FA itself, they've got a small panel to fight against accusations, but nothing in terms of from a grassroots level seems to be done.
So it seems to be a problem here in regards to racism has been acknowledged. They're aware of it. I mean, we've got people like the FIFA president talking around addressing it. We see it on football matches, don't we, Professor Cashmore, where we've seen, show racism the card. We see that World Cups, and whether Germany's playing Argentina, whether there's always showing these particular. The UK government are concerned of the rise of racism in sport, and particularly football, and some of the incidents and statistics that are produced. For example, there were 520 incidents in 2017-18, up from 469 in 2016 and 17, with a large over 50% of these racially, rooted. So in that regard, Professor Cashmore, it seems as though this whole notion and problem is there's one aspect of racism in sport, as far as the fans are concerned, where we see the chanting, we see the abuse, and we have to take in consideration that racism in itself, by definition, also constitutes, bullying and intimidation, etc., etc. So there's an aspect of racism that is targeting players, for example. And the other end of the spectrum, as Lincoln was just alluded to, is an aspect where it seems to be more institutionalized within certain governing bodies and governments and sort of probably those who are in sort of strategic positions. Would you agree with that?
In this country, yes, but abroad, probably not quite. The reason for saying that is that there are other parts of the world, Eastern Europe, for example, Italy, where there is just a racist problem amongst the crowd, week in, week out. And I think there's not one size fits all if you're trying to explain this. I think you've got to look at the particular areas and say what contributes to racism in Eastern Europe. I think you can do that, and then I think you can look further afield to Italy and say that there are far-right groups that have historically taken root amongst football crowds, and that's probably the reason there. And compared to these two areas, I mean, I don't want to sound naive or bland when I say this, but the problem in Britain isn't too bad by comparison. And I'm not saying that it doesn't need to be addressed, because obviously it does. But it's nowhere near the scale or intensity as it is abroad. We do hear about racism in football crowds and even on the field of play, but we don't hear about it that often. I mean, this isn't a habitual thing. You know, this isn't something that we hear about every week now. And I mean, I'm not saying we should be grateful for small mercies, because it's still it still exists. I'm not kidding myself. But I don't think it's anywhere near what's going on elsewhere in the country, particularly Eastern Europe. I mean, there is a colossal problem over there. The question is that, as you say, putting up banners saying kick racism out of football or there's no room for racism, they don't do a scrap of good, in my opinion. I mean, what good is that? You know, does anybody in the world not realise that racism is wrong and we could do without it? You don't need to be told kick racism out of football. You know, it's almost patronising to football fans to say we're going to put up a poster and try and remind you. I think the time has come now where football authorities have just got to show their colours and say we're going to penalise this.
I mean, just to quickly pick up so banning somebody from a game such as Luis Suarez, for example, for 8-match ban, does that really address the underpinning issues of racism, or is just right? We're going to just appease people?
No. Don't run away with this idea. Okay. I'm not suggesting that punishment is going to get to the root of the problem, but I don't think we can. I think that the best football can do is manage it. Any sport, for that matter. Football's job, basketball's job, hockey's job is not to get rid of racism from society generally. It can't do that.
So, Professor Cashmore, what we are saying, banning an individual for making racial remarks who they, for example, Luis Suarez denies allegations, is that really addressing the underpinning issues of racism?
No, it's not. But I don't think any particular sport, whether it's football, basketball, whatever, I don't think its job is to get rid of racism from society generally. Can't do it. The best it can do, any sport can do, is to manage the problem in its own context. And the educational route, I know Lincoln is going to disagree with me, and I'd probably disagree with myself a few years ago. And I'm an educator for a living, you know, I earn my trade educating people. But I just think that the time is over for that. I just don't think you can do any more. I think you just have to say, okay, this is what we're going to do from this point on. We're going to punish clubs. The clubs are ultimately responsible for the behaviour of their own fans, and we know we know that you probably can't do anything about a lot of what goes on, but we're going to punish you in any case. And that way, the fans will become more self-policing. In other words, let's say if a club is barred from European competition for 12 months, then the fans would be disinclined to chant any racism, racist remarks, or whatever it is. They'd be disinclined to do that because another fan will say, "Hey, cut that out! Remember where it got us last time? It got us kicked out of Europe." There is another prong to this, though, and I think that that the sponsors of clubs, don't forget, football clubs nowadays, like every major sporting organisation, has lots of sponsors, and I think those sponsors could exercise some pressure on clubs to do something about it. So, for example, Chevrolet, who sponsor Manchester United, go along to United and say, well, you know, this racism, it seems to be cropping up quite a lot. What are you doing about it? And United would probably say, well, nothing actually. Oh, okay. Because, you know, Chevrolet's headquarters are in Detroit. And you do realize the population of Detroit demographically is a substantial amount of African Americans, a huge majority of African Americans. This is kind of embarrassing for us. And I think that when those sponsors get interested in this and embarrassed by it, they might bring pressure to bear on football clubs to do something about it. Now, exactly what they'll do, I don't know.
I mean, Lincoln, you work with it and see some of the issues, and Professor Cashmore made reference to that. What do you think about his view, that you may have some different view on that?
I think with the increase of CCTVs in the football grounds, that's where you're seeing a lot of the changes. The CCTVs is not just aimed at the spectators for their safety, but it's also highlighted those who are making chants. Quite recently, how many people from the Arsenal section has been identified for making Yiddish chants? How many people at other grounds who have made unsociable chants have been identified? Once they've been identified, that put the club sponsors, as the professor said, in the limelight. And I think the increased use of it has created a difference within the football grounds. But outside the football grounds, no one seems to be doing much to change the environment. The environment being how many black supporters has been attacked, whether it's in Eastern Europe, which that happened to myself in Poland, or just even walking up to, not identify any particular grounds in England, but certain grounds, if you're a black supporter and you're walking just down the road, you are liable to be attacked for the only reason being the colour of your skin. The England supporters, there used to be a group of us used to go and watch England. That don't happen, because we could be in a bar after and we'll get people from who's got a different notion, who don't like us wearing an England top. They don't like us supporting. Inside the ground, it seems to be contained, but outside the ground, it is not contained at all. It's
back to what we were saying earlier then regarding some of the message that we're giving out. We're talking about show racism in the card, and that's as far as we're going to some extent. But also taking into consideration, we shouldn't be judging players on the colour of their skin, irrespective of white, black, Asian, whoever they may be. We should be judging them on the basis of their skill, knowledge, and the expertise they're contributing to the game.
I think we do.
Which we do. Obviously, we can see that happening for the most part.
They don't elsewhere.
I mean, Lord Ashton, just to bring in another aspect of it, because we've got one element where we discussed at the beginning of the show, we've got fans who are guilty then of sort of committing such injustices or antisocial behaviour or such, you know, if racism is prejudice or an ideology or it's driven by something else, racism. Lord Ashton have hired a Conservative peer quite recently, and others debated this issue in the House of Lords. He's currently the Digital Culture, Media and Sports Minister. He even makes reference to one of these big issues which is being discussed and debated, and obviously we'll see the action subsequent to that. He said, "I admire enormously," and I'm quoting Raheem Sterling and others, "but we need to look at other aspects of diversity." You know, he also stated that Wilfred Zaha, Raheem Sterling, Danny Rose deserve our respect for speaking out. Okay, that's speaking out against them experiencing abuse, racism in whatever form. But also there's another aspect of it, you know, that the game on the other end of the spectrum is being predominantly controlled, and it was discussed in the same debate which took place this April in 2019, that the actual game now, as far as institutional other forms of racism are concerned, is actually controlled by white middle class Men, would you agree with that? That there is another degree of racism that is impacting the game?
Let me just backtrack a little bit, Jazz, if I may. The Danny Rose incident, that he was complaining about about abuse abroad, not about what happened domestically. The Raheem Sterling case, he was grumbling about the media's coverage. Okay, so neither one of those was talking about any particular incident that had taken place at British football grounds. I'm not quite. I've got to be honest. I'm not quite sure what the sting was here. What was the question again?
The question is about now the degree of control, because obviously people control what's been shown, when it's shown, who's shown by it, who gets access to it. We're talking about racism in sport, even though we're talking about coverage of things happening internationally. Yeah. The Patrice Evra and Luis Suarez was in the Premiership. Yeah. That game took place within Britain, no. so and that was a very big thing. You're talking one of the biggest players in the sport. So and that impact that it has. But there's other aspects of it that need to be discussed. And when we're talking about who's controlling the game and the diversity, because I've just made reference to a quote from Lord Ashton that the diversity of the game is also being damaged and at a risk of being discriminated.
I understand the question now. Okay. And I think what we're really talking about is diversity at
the top, which is another aspect.
Than on the field play. It could be argued that there aren't enough black managers. There certainly are no black owners, and maybe not senior administrators either. So although if you took a superficial view of football, you'd say, this is a culturally diverse game, and it is, but it's sort of bottom-loaded, that all the diversity is down here, which is not to say that the footballers themselves are not an elite, because if you're earning several £1 million a year, then you're taking home a nice wage.
It's a dream wage packet.
And I suppose they think to themselves, it's worth keeping your mouth closed,
absolutely,
rather than becoming unpopular. If I'm earning 8 or 10 million a year, I can probably take a bit of stick every so often, and I won't say too much about it because it may get me a kind of a reputation that will prevent me earning this kind of money from now on, or prevent me getting the endorsement contracts that are a very lucrative source of income. So that could happen. But there is, of course, a lot of people who complain that there aren't as many black managers as we should have. Two ways of looking at this. The first is that if you look at the number, the whole football industry population, then as I said, it's bottom-loaded. There aren't enough black people at the top. Another way of looking at it is, how many managers are from African Caribbean backgrounds? 5%? 6%? Well, that's probably a fair reflection of African Caribbeans in the general population. Mm. So there are two ways of looking at it.
I mean, so that statement must be correct. If Lord Ashton says that the game and others, and it was discussed within Parliament and other places, that it is controlled by white men, and how would you then say we can address that or change and alter that it is not controlled by particular individuals who may be or may not be discriminating against it?
I'm not sure if you can force anything.
Because I mean, Lincoln.
I think there's certain underground movements what's being made by elite footballers, black footballers, who have come together. Some are raising their concerns, and some who are behind the pillars of power, who are challenging them. You don't hear about it in the media, but I've been privy enough to sit at a couple of meetings where high-level footballers, there's 26% of current professional footballers in this country are black. Mm-hmm. The voice itself...
Is it up to that, then?
26%, yes.
26%?
26. Yes.
Hang on, let me get this right.
From Premiership all the way down.
A quarter of all managers in the
Not managers, footballers.
Ballers, players, the players, yes.
Sorry, yeah.
The managers is obviously
Yeah,
different.
yeah.
I was gonna say,
Yes.
That really blew my argument out of the water.
No. And what they're saying is, if you look at the percentage rate, then there should be more coming through to become.
If you look at it from
Now, so this is where the problem lies. This is where probably, if we can talk with, it's a barrier, a problem, whether it's intentional, because we're looking at some of these statements that are made.
On the other hand, what I always remind people is that is it such a glamorous profession to get into, football management? The average lifespan is, 14 months?
Yeah.
You've got incredible insecurity of job. You're going to get lambasted on social media. You're going to have people probably spitting at you in the street if results go against you. Your family is often in jeopardy. I don't think it's a particularly desirable job. So perhaps they got their head screwed on and think, screw this, I'll go into media or something like that.
But I think in terms of promoting diversity and addressing the issue of racism, probably at all levels of the spectrum, because if you get to the top, you can influence a lot of the stuff.
Well, that is true.
Now, another aspect of it then, Professor and Lincoln, is the fact that if we're talking around promoting that diversity at the top level of the sport, whether it's the FA, UEFA, the Premiership, etc., then surely we'll be able to balance out the representation a lot better in terms of the journalists that allowed exposure to these places, games, and etc., and obviously promoting more players with the black, Asian, and that's another statistic that's very low at the moment. There's a lot of, and you've probably seen a lot of Asian players and others come through the system, and even the potential of promoting managers. Okay, we've got people who will buy the clubs like the Emirates and they have the money in the backing, but now we need the particular individuals in particular roles in order to address the balance, and then we can see clearly, Professor Lincoln, that we are making strides. Would you agree with that?
I think the majority of managers now is about looking at the foreign managers, not looking at diversity, but looking at their cultural background. And because most clubs in the Premiership is owned by overseas owners, they will then bring in overseas managers. So what that's going to do is put back the diversity of black managers or even black coaches and stop them growing as such. But as I says, the movement of a group of highly paid and Premiership footballers, black footballers, they're starting to challenge this, starting to say, well, let's get educated to the sense of education linked to strategically minded sit on boards. Let's look at ownership, look at the Queen's Park Rangers, what's happening there. You look at the Les Ferdinands, who's now very vital in the movement in trying to open up doors for those who are less fortunate.
And this is one of the conferences you did, Lincoln, was a few years ago, was at Birmingham City Football Club, around these kind of issues, and there was even Jason Richards from the Premiership, and he's always on Match of the Day. He was there, some other players, and they were invited to come along and see or make contributions. So, there seems to be a lot of stuff that you were doing as well in the conferences that were discussing some of the same issues.
Again, as I said, in the media, you don't hear about it, so you don't think it happens. But behind closed doors, especially from a root to branch perspective, there's a lot of work what's going on. And how do you bring it out there? People like myself who always had a voice, what the FA has done is took that voice off me. All the roles I sat, from race equality to anything linked to racial, the FA is kind of says these roles don't exist anymore because they carried the flag. So then what will happen is it kind of silenced myself, but then you'll have high prominent people from a footballing playing perspective who's now becoming the voice. We mentioned earlier Danny Rose and like-minded people, where you'll have the general public who'll actually listen to what they have to say. So the likes of Lincoln Moses and like-minded people, oh, you're irrelevant now because you don't carry the same
weight or same authority or same power.
So, now you're getting the top-minded footballers coming out and making their comments. People will start saying, yes, we are going to see some positive changes.
Then Professor Cashmore, then we need then to look at possible sanctions or taking action, not just, as I said, against players on the pitch or players against each other, players and club. What about taking the action? And we just quoted some quotes of people in these kind of positions who are making certain decisions not in the interest of diverse whatever. What about sanctions for them and saying, right, you've done your done some damage, if you want to use that word, and you've not really enabled for us to allow this game to flourish in the way we're talking. Surely we need people to be possibly taken out of them, post and replaced with a bit of a balance, or sanctions, tougher sanctions.
It's not against the law, remember, to keep appointing white managers. I mean, we know that culturally it's always applauded if you appoint someone from a different ethnic background to the usual, standard issue white. But it's not against the law or anything, so clubs are perfectly entitled. There has been a movement to try to get the Rooney Rule introduced over here. Now, the Rooney Rule was pioneered in the United States. It was an interesting innovation, and it meant basically that clubs, when they were appointing they would call them coaches over there, coaching staff at any level, they would be obliged to include at least one minority candidate on their shortlist. And it didn't seem a tremendously good idea at the outset, but it did pay dividends, and of course, anything's worth a try. Now, people are saying that we should introduce something like that over here. That can't work over here, because people who own football clubs, whether it's the Sheikh or Abramovich, are just going to say to the Premier League, you don't tell me what to do. I own this club. This is my property. I'll appoint who I like. So don't tell me to. But
surely there's some breach going on, or they're breaking some possible.
At the moment, Jazz. It isn't a breach.
Not at this particular.
It would be if they introduced the Rooney Rule.
Yes.
But you can imagine how popular that would be amongst owners over here, where we have a much more laissez-faire approach to the whole game. Compliance isn't a big deal over here. In America, it is.
Which obviously back to the Patrick Ewing and even the former owner of or manager of the Los Angeles Lakers basketball team was banned for life.
They come down like
literally for life, and I think if we had a bit of a tougher approach at that level, you think then people will take heed the message?
No, I agree with you. I think that at that level, if you penalise the club, then I think you would start seeing changes. Because the fans would then know that they really were endangering their own club.
I think with the FA, National FA, they've got a group called the IAG, Inclusion Advisory Group, led by Paul Elliott, and they are the ones who are trying to introduce, I believe, the Rooney Rule and other like-minded diversity aimed at black and non-whites community. Whether or not it will work, they've been together for several years now, and behind the scenes they're implementing quite a few changes. They are the ones who are supposed to be putting pressure on the governing bodies to make sure there's more equality. Again, whether it's a talk shop or we actually are making changes, who am I to say?
I mean, as you just mentioned there, and as we're coming towards the end of the show, it's a question where, do we need some representatives or advocates that are selected from local communities to make the bridge or the link between FA or the presidents and at grassroots levels in certain countries, particularly in England, to go to some of these summits and meetings and put these kind of proposals forward and actually see some of them proposals put into place, a bit like when United Nations do resolutions and other things. It's all member states and they adhere to its aspect of seeing terrorism and other aspects. So do we need something like that in your view, and Professor New, but first Lincoln, and in your view, do we need possible advocates?
I think we do. I think what they have to adapt is FIFA. Actually, the most powerful nations out there are those who come from CONCACAF. And FIFA tends to look after them a lot, and they need to adapt some of the way they work with CONCACAF to other like-minded countries in Europe, because CONCACAF carries the votes, so they'll look after them, and because they would look after them, divert some of the attention what you're giving to to the CONCACAF members, yet the country doesn't benefit from what they're doing, but the members
do.
Yeah.
And your view in the same question there, Professor Cashmore?
Well, look, football is the most diverse game in the world, bar none. I mean, it's not only the most popular, but culturally it's played, by every group on the planet, I imagine. So it's an embarrassment that racism even appears in any form in this sport. I think that the days for education are over. I don't think anybody, any right-minded football fan, doesn't realise that racism has no place in football and should be stamped out. If they do need reminding, they're not a football fan. I don't know what they're doing watching football, but they should know that. I think that the next step has to be less educational, more penalty, and I just think that somehow the organisations have to confirm to the rest of the world that they are taking racism seriously, because so far they haven't. Ground closures, fines that are effectively slaps on the wrist, they're doing no good whatsoever. They have to get tough and say, you're responsible for your own fans. If they get up to no good, then we know you can't effectively do anything about it, but we're going to blame you anyway, and we're going to punish you, and this is how we're going to punish you. And that way, I think it would devolve down to the fans because they don't want to harm their own clubs.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Cashmore and Lincoln Moses, for coming onto the show and discussing a topic our viewers will no doubt will find interesting, and some of them out there will be playing sports and various sports. So, and thank you to the viewers for watching at home, the Insight Show here on the Akaal Channel. Myself, Jasper and Bora. Thank you and God bless for tuning in. Until next time.